Sometimes we refer to the gospel as good news, and it's not always, it doesn't always feel, if you will, like good news. But interestingly enough, the reading from Hebrews, the second reading, gives us a focus, I think, for a reflection for us this morning. The long praise of the faith of Abraham and Sarah provides the basis for us to look at what does faithful discipleship look like? What does faithful leadership look like? Which is clearly picked up in the gospel passage we just heard from Luke, telling us really two parables. But God's choice of Abraham and Sarah is, of course, a really interesting one. He chooses them to create descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. But then look at how the author of Hebrews describes the two of them. Abraham was past the normal age. Anyone here think about themselves as past the normal age? Past the normal age for discipleship and leadership? And how about Sarah, who was sterile, who was barren? Anyone here feel metaphorically or literally sterile or barren at times? I'm sure lots of us. But look where you are today on this 19th Sunday of the church year, August 11th. You're here. You gather with other people, with like-minded people who continue to wrestle with what does being ready mean? What does being ready mean? Dressed for action and with our lamps lit. Today's gospel makes for difficult reading, I think, during these dog days of summer, of August, Don't push it too much. We're in vacation and maybe vocation mode. I think it speaks of things that we'd like to kind of push aside for a while. Simple living, for example. Almsgiving. Readiness for the return of the Lord. Faithful use of the time that's been given us. We don't know the time or the hour. How well do I use it? The first verses of today's gospel from Luke are actually the conclusion to a long passage in which Jesus talks about the proper use of possessions, and it began with last week's gospel. And the lectionary today omits verses 22 to 31 of this 12th chapter of Luke, where Jesus proclaims freedom from material anxieties and calls for a radical trust in God. A God who cares for the birds of the air, remember that? A God who is concerned about the lilies of the field. And concludes with an exhortation to seek real treasures with God. For where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. The heart, of course, is the biblical center of the person's being and their desires, and designates really what's most important for us. So we're here this morning because our hearts are filled with passion. We're still trying to figure out how to do the discipleship thing, how to be faithful around that. We are here because we want to take responsibility for our baptismal promises and our religious vows. The long praise of the faith of Abraham and Sarah and of the ancients that we heard from Hebrews provides the basis of what faithful discipleship and leadership is about, to which our baptismal promises and our religious vows commit ourselves. Abraham and Sarah began their pilgrimage of faith and were even ready to sacrifice their future trying to be faithful to God. Their future was their son Isaac, and they were even willing to give up that to be faithful to God. The ancients most likely referenced in Hebrews are those folks wandering around in the desert. And while they griped and whined enough, they also continued their journey. They continued to try to be faithful to this promise, this hope that their covenantal God had given them. Future hope rather than present trials shaped their lives. For faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Well, things and times have changed since Vatican II. Where are we with the signs of the times? Are we still trying to read those signs of the times in the context of our own era and our own culture? What do we need to do to be a voice of discipleship, to be faithful leaders, both as individuals and as members of a community of faith? So the question, I think, that the uncomfortable one is, where is your heart today? What's pushing you? What got you here today? And so as we gather once again in this chapel, we gather aware that the church is still reeling from sexual crimes of clergy and a lack of leadership of the episcopacy. Our country is reeling too from the latest of too much violence that kills people. Many deaths at the hands of guns carried by racists and white supremacists. What we now are calling domestic terrorism. And we're still reeling from political rhetoric that is divisive and xenophobic. It's also a time in which we see a lot of indifference to the gospel values that Jesus talks about today and others. It's a time when faith is tested. And people, ourselves, we must ask ourselves, okay, where is my treasure? Where is it today? Where is the hope that gets me here and continues to motivate me? Yet we also believe that it's also a time when Jesus will show up, when Jesus will be present to us, to those vigilant servants who are trying to be faithful. A time when God's pilgrim people are challenged to go forward with the faith of Abraham and Sarah, able to bring forth life from death, a people gathered in hope amidst the darkness. Archbishop Laurie of Baltimore and Archbishop Gregory of Washington just recently wrote letters to us asking us to be people of faith, to continue to be the disciples who will manifest a hope and a belief in the human spirit and in the possibility of change. So the gospel ends today with, to whom much is given, much is expected. So what do you and I do with what we've been given?